The stagecoach wheels kicked up dust that hung suspended in the still air as Josephine Valenti clutched her worn leather valise, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The Texas landscape stretched before her, barren and cracked, nothing like the green Pennsylvania hills she'd left behind. The year was 1875, and the drought that gripped Madisonville showed no sign of mercy as the driver called out their arrival in a town that looked more dead than alive. "This here's Madisonville, madam," the driver announced, his voice as dry as the land around them. "Last stop." Josephine smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirt and straightened her back. 22 years old and already a widow, she had answered Preston Galloway's advertisement for a mail-order bride with more desperation than hope. His letters had painted a picture of prosperity, a thriving cattle ranch with fertile land and promise. What greeted her instead was a town withering under a punishing sun. "Thank you," she said, accepting the driver's calloused hand as she descended from the coach. Main Street was barely deserving of the name. A handful of buildings lined the dusty thoroughfare, their wood bleached nearly white from the relentless sun. A few men milled about, their faces haggard, their eyes carrying the weight of the drought. They regarded her with mild curiosity, but little else. "You must be the mail-order bride," a woman said, approaching with a limp from the general store. Her face was kind despite the weariness etched into it. "I'm Martha Wilson. We've been expecting you." "Josephine Valenti," she replied, shaking the woman's hand. "I'm here to meet Preston Galloway." Martha's expression flickered with something Josephine couldn't quite read. "Preston's still out at his ranch. He couldn't get away today, the cattle, you understand." Josephine nodded, though she didn't understand at all. Surely a man would make time to meet his future wife. "Frank," Martha called to a young boy lounging in the shade of the mercantile, "run out to the Galloway place and tell Preston his bride is here." The boy took off, dust trailing behind his bare feet. "Let me get you something to drink," Martha said. "Must have been a terrible journey in this heat." The inside of the general store was marginally cooler than outside. Martha poured water from a pitcher, the glass sweating immediately in the dry heat. "Preston's a good man," Martha said, though Josephine hadn't asked. "This drought has been hard on everyone, especially the ranchers." "His letters didn't mention a drought," Josephine said quietly. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Men can be proud, and the worst of it came after he sent for you, I suspect. 3 months without rain now." The door creaked open 2 hours later, and Josephine turned to see a tall man standing in the doorway, his silhouette stark against the bright light outside. He removed his hat, revealing sandy hair streaked with sun and sweat dampened at the temples. "Miss Valenti?" he asked, his voice deeper than she'd imagined from his letters. She stood, smoothing her skirt again. "Mr. Galloway." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hand extended. When she took it, his palm was rough with calluses, but his grip was gentle. His eyes, the blue of a clear winter sky, assessed her with undisguised appreciation. "You're more beautiful than I dared hope," he said softly. Heat crept up her neck that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Your letters didn't mention the drought," she said, more bluntly than she'd intended. His expression faltered. "No, I suppose they didn't." "Would you have come if they had?" Martha interjected. Preston shot her a look of irritation before returning his attention to Josephine. "I meant to write, but things got worse quickly. I didn't want to frighten you off." "So you thought surprising me would be better?" Josephine raised an eyebrow. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'm beginning to think you're not easily frightened, Miss Valenti." She wasn't sure if that was true, but she wouldn't show weakness now. "I came here for a fresh start, Mr. Galloway. I would have appreciated honesty from the beginning." He nodded, his expression sobering. "You're right. And you deserve to know exactly what you're walking into." He gestured toward the door. "Let me show you my ranch, our ranch, if you'll still have me and we can talk properly." Josephine hesitated, then nodded. "I've come too far to turn back without at least seeing what I've gotten myself into." Preston's wagon was simple but sturdy, pulled by 2 horses that looked better fed than many of the people in town. As they left Madisonville behind, the landscape opened up to reveal miles of parched grassland. This is normally good grazing land, Preston explained, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for rain clouds. The creek that runs through my property is down to a trickle. I've lost 12 head of cattle already. How many do you have left? Josephine asked. 38. I sold some before they could die, used the money to dig a deeper well. His knuckles whitened around the reins. It's not enough. Without rain soon. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. In your letters, you described a successful ranch, she ventured. It was. It will be again. There was steel in his voice. I won't lie to you, Josephine. May I call you Josephine? She nodded. Things are hard right now, harder than I ever expected. But this land. His eyes swept the horizon with genuine love. This land is worth fighting for, and I believe the rain will come again. They crested a small rise, and Preston's ranch came into view. The house was modest but well built. A single-story structure with a porch wrapping around two sides. A barn stood nearby, along with a corral and several outbuildings. In the distance, cattle clustered near what must be the creek he'd mentioned. It's not what I promised you, Preston said quietly. If you want to go back to town, arrange passage back east. I'll understand. Josephine studied his profile, the strong jaw tensed with pride and worry, the determined set of his shoulders despite the burden he carried. She'd come west for a new beginning, yes, but also for security after the hard years following her husband's death in the coal mines. Preston Galloway might not be offering the prosperity he'd promised, but there was something about his quiet dignity that stirred her. I'm not one to run at the first sign of trouble, Mr. Galloway. He turned to her, surprise and something warmer lighting his eyes. Preston, please. Preston, she tested the name. I made a commitment when I answered your advertisement. I'm here now, and I'm willing to see if we can make this work, drought or not. The relief on his face was palpable. As they approached the ranch house, he said softly, We'll weather this storm together, Josephine. I promise you that. It was the first promise she was inclined to believe. The inside of the ranch house was clean and surprisingly cool, designed to keep out the worst of the Texas heat. Preston showed her through the main room with its stone fireplace, the small kitchen with its pump sink, and the two bedrooms, one his and one that had been prepared for her. I know mail-order arrangements usually assume immediate marriage, he said, a flush creeping up his neck. But I thought, given the circumstances, you might want time to be sure, to get to know me and the place before making your final decision. The consideration touched her. Her first husband, Thomas, had been a childhood friend, their marriage arranged by parents who saw a good match. His death after just 2 years had left her adrift in a town where opportunities for women were limited to remarriage or servitude. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded, visibly relieved. There's a lock on your door, and Mrs. Wilson from town has agreed to come stay with us for propriety's sake until you decide. Mrs. Wilson agreed to this? Josephine asked, remembering the woman's limp. Her husband died last winter. The drought's been hard on her too. She can't keep her garden alive in town. Here. At least we have the well. Josephine understood then it was an arrangement of mutual benefit. Martha would provide respectability and companionship, while Preston would provide water and food. When will she arrive? Tomorrow. Tonight I'll sleep in the barn. That's not necessary, Josephine began. It is, Preston insisted gently. Your reputation matters here. This is a small town and people talk. She appreciated his concern, even as she wondered at the wisdom of her decision to come here. What kind of life could they build in this parched land? As if reading her thoughts, Preston said, I know it doesn't look like much now, but I have plans, Josephine. Once the rain comes, this land will flourish again. I've set aside seed for when the drought breaks, and I have ideas for making the ranch more resistant to dry spells in the future. His optimism was compelling. Tell me these plans, she said. Over a simple dinner of beans, cornbread, and the last of his preserved venison, Preston outlined his vision. He spoke of cisterns to capture rainwater, irrigation channels from the creek, drought-resistant crops he'd heard about from settlers further west. His hands moved expressively as he talked, his eyes alight with possibility rather than defeat. "You've thought of everything," she remarked when he finally paused. "Except the rain," he said with a wry smile. "Can't seem to make that happen, no matter how hard I work." "Perhaps that's why God sent me instead," she said lightly. His laugh surprised her, rich and genuine. "Are you a rainmaker, Josephine Valenti?" "I've been called many things, but never that," she smiled, the first real smile since her arrival. "Though I did bring an umbrella in my trunk. An optimist. I like that." Night fell quickly, the temperature dropping with the sun. Preston lit a lamp and showed her where everything was in the kitchen before preparing to leave for the barn. "I left water for washing in your room," he said. "It's precious these days, but a lady deserves to be comfortable after such a long journey." The thoughtfulness of the gesture water that had to be hauled from his dwindling well wasn't lost on her. "Thank you, Preston." He paused at the door, hat in hand. "I'm sorry again about the drought, about not being honest in my letters." "Why did you still send for me?" she asked. "Surely a wife is another mouth to feed in hard times." He considered this, choosing his words carefully. "A ranch isn't just land and cattle, it's a home, and I've been lacking that. Even before the drought, there was something missing." He met her eyes. "I want someone to build with, Josephine, someone to share the good times and weather the bad." With that, he wished her good night and stepped into the darkness, leaving her to ponder his words as she prepared for bed. The next morning dawned as hot and dry as the previous day. Josephine woke early, used to rising with the sun from her years helping her father in his store before her first marriage. She found coffee beans in the kitchen and was brewing a pot when Preston came in from tending to his morning chores. He stopped short at the sight of her. Already dressed and working in his kitchen. "You didn't have to do that." "I'm an early riser," she replied, pouring him a cup. "And I'm not one for sitting idle." He accepted the coffee gratefully. "Mrs. Wilson will be here around noon. I need to check the cattle in the creek today. Would you like to come along, see more of the ranch?" She agreed, eager to better understand this place that might become her home. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush, they set out on horseback. Preston had saddled a gentle mare for her, apologizing that it wasn't a proper lady's mount. "I rode astride plenty as a girl," she assured him, gathering her skirts and mounting with practiced ease. "My father believed girls should be capable." "A wise man," Preston said with approval. They rode first to the creek, where the trickle Preston had described proved to be barely that, just a thin ribbon of water winding through a mostly dry creek bed. Cattle gathered at the widest spot, drinking from a small pool that Preston had clearly dug deeper to capture what flow remained. "I rotate them," he explained, dismounting to check the water level. "Can't have them all drinking at once or they'd drain it dry. It's a constant balance, giving them enough to survive without using it all." Josephine slid from her horse to stand beside him. "How long can you continue like this?" "Another month, maybe 2 if we're careful." He ran a hand through his hair. After that, the rain will come," she said firmly. He glanced at her, a small smile playing at his lips. "You sound certain?" "Someone needs to be. Faith doesn't work if you're constantly doubting." They moved on to check the cattle. Even to Josephine's untrained eye, they looked thin, their ribs showing through dusty hides. Preston spoke to each animal they passed, sometimes using names, sometimes just murmuring encouragement. His gentleness with the beasts spoke volumes about his character. "These are the last of my breeding stock," he said as they reached a small group of cows with young calves. "If I can keep them alive, there's hope for rebuilding once the drought breaks." One of the calves, bolder than the rest, approached Josephine's horse curiously. "What's this one's name?" she asked, charmed by its innocent face. "Doesn't have one yet," Preston replied. "Would you like to name it?" The simple offer touched her. "Hope," she decided. "Her name is Hope." Preston's eyes met hers, warm with something she wasn't ready to name. A perfect choice. By the time they returned to the ranch house, Martha Wilson had arrived in a wagon driven by the same boy who'd fetched Preston the day before. Her few possessions were quickly moved into the small second bedroom, which Josephine insisted she take, while she herself would sleep on a pallet in the main room. "Nonsense," Martha said firmly. "You're to be the mistress of this house. I'm just here as companion and chaperone until the wedding." "If there's a wedding," Josephine corrected gently. "We've agreed to take time to be sure." Martha gave Preston an approving look. "Decent of you, boy. Your father would be proud." That evening, with Martha's presence allowing for proper propriety, Preston joined them in the house for dinner. The older woman proved to be an excellent cook, even with limited ingredients, and her stories of Madisonville's earlier, better days helped paint a picture of what the region could be again. "This isn't the first drought," Martha assured them. "Won't be the last. The land recovers, and so do the people." "How long have you lived here?" Josephine asked. "Coming on 30 years now. Came as a bride myself, though not mail order. My Henry was passing through Pennsylvania selling horses when we met." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "We had droughts, floods, grasshopper plagues, you name it, but the good years made up for the bad." "Pennsylvania?" Josephine leaned forward. "Where in Pennsylvania?" "Little town called Mill Vale, outside Pittsburgh." "I'm from Harwick. That's less than 20 miles away." The coincidence delighted both women, and they spent the evening discovering mutual acquaintances and shared experiences. Preston watched them with evident pleasure, offering little to the conversation, but clearly enjoying the lively atmosphere in his previously lonely home. Days stretched into a week as Josephine settled into life at the ranch. She quickly established routines helping Martha with cooking and preserving what food they had, learning from Preston about the cattle and the land. Each morning, she joined him to check the creek levels, their rides becoming a time for conversation and growing familiarity. Preston, she discovered, had inherited the ranch from his father 5 years earlier. He'd expanded it successfully until the drought hit, turning what had been prosperity into a daily struggle for survival. But beneath his worry ran a deep, abiding love for the land and a stubborn refusal to abandon what his family had built. For her part, Josephine shared stories of her brief first marriage, her husband's death in a mine collapse, and the limited options that had led her to answer Preston's advertisement. "I could have stayed in Harwick," she admitted one morning as they sat beside the dwindling creek. "Married again to someone local. But after Thomas died, I wanted something different, something that was a choice rather than just the expected path." "And now you've chosen drought and hardship," Preston said ruefully. "Not much of an improvement." "I've chosen possibility," she corrected him. "This drought won't last forever. And there's something honest about this struggle that I respect more than false security." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond the practical exterior she presented to the world. "You're not what I expected, Josephine Valenti." "Is that disappointment or approval in your voice, Mr. Galloway?" "Definite approval," he said softly. On the 10th day, disaster struck. Preston returned from checking the furthest pasture with grim news: 5 more cattle dead, overcome by heat and thirst. "We're losing them faster now," he said that evening, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "The well's dropping too. Another few weeks like this." Martha exchanged a look with Josephine across the table. "There's talk in town of a cattle drive north," she said carefully. "Some of the other ranchers are banding together, taking their herds to Kansas where there's been rain." Preston's jaw tightened. "Selling out, you mean?" "Surviving," Martha corrected. "Sometimes retreat isn't surrender, boy. It's strategy." "This land is my father's legacy. I won't abandon it." "No one's suggesting abandonment," Josephine said gently. "But if the choice is between losing everything or salvaging what you can to rebuild later." Preston pushed back from the table. "I need some air." After he'd gone, Martha sighed deeply. Stubborn as his father, James Galloway would have done the same, stay and fight even when fighting seemed hopeless. "Is it truly hopeless?" Josephine asked quietly. Martha's weathered face softened. No, child. There's always hope while there's life. But Preston needs to consider all his options, not just the one his pride prefers. Later that night, Josephine found Preston sitting on the porch steps, staring at the star-filled sky. She settled beside him, careful to maintain a proper distance. "I'm sorry if I overstepped earlier," she said. He shook his head. "You didn't. You're being practical, and I should be too." He picked up a handful of dry dirt, letting it sift through his fingers. "But this land, it's more than property to me, Josephine. It's where my parents are buried. It's where I learned to ride, to rope, to be a man. Walking away, even temporarily, would feel like failure," she finished for him. "Yes." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night air cooling around them. "What if there was another way?" Josephine finally asked. "Not abandoning the ranch, but not watching everything die either?" He turned to her, interest kindling in his eyes. "What are you thinking? You have breeding stock you're desperate to save. What if we focus on just keeping them alive? Sell the others to fund improvements that will help when the rains return? Use the money to deepen the well, build those cisterns you talked about." Preston considered this. It would mean selling most of the herd. Better than watching them die, surely. And you'd be investing in the future of the ranch, not abandoning it. He was quiet for so long she thought he might have rejected the idea. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. It makes sense. It's not what I want, but..." He looked at her directly. "Thank you for seeing another path when I couldn't." "That's what partners do," she said, then flushed at the implication. His hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Is that what we're becoming, Josephine? Partners?" Her heart quickened at his touch, at the question in his voice. "I think we might be," she admitted softly. His fingers tightened around hers. "I'd like that very much." The next morning, Preston rode into town to speak with other ranchers about selling cattle and possibly joining the drive north with his remaining stock. Josephine and Martha used his absence to tackle the veranda, sweeping away dust and arranging Preston's 2 battered chairs to create a more welcoming space. "He likes you," Martha observed as they worked. "More than likes, I'd say." Josephine concentrated on sweeping. "We're still getting to know each other." "Sometimes that's enough to know," the older woman said wisely. "My Henry proposed after 2 weeks. When it's right, it's right. And in the middle of a drought that threatens everything he's built, that hardly seems the time for romance," Martha laughed. "Child, there's never a perfect time. Life doesn't wait for convenience." She paused, leaning on her broom. "Preston Galloway is a good man, honorable to his bones like his father before him. The drought will end, but a man's character, that's something you can count on through any weather." Josephine couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt toward Preston. His dedication to the land, his gentle way with animals, his consideration for her comfort despite their dire circumstances, all painted a picture of a man worth knowing better. And sometimes, when their eyes met over the dinner table or while riding side by side, she felt a connection that went beyond practical partnership. Preston returned late that afternoon with news. Several ranchers had already committed to the cattle drive, and there was a buyer in town offering fair prices for those who preferred to sell outright. "I've arranged to sell 20 head, he told them. "Keep 18 of the strongest breeding stock. It's not ideal, but..." He glanced at Josephine. "It's the smart choice for the future." The sale was completed 2 days later. Preston returned with more money than he'd seen in months, enough to fund the improvements they had discussed and keep them fed until the drought broke. "First thing is deepening the well," he said that evening as they sat around the kitchen table making plans. "Then cisterns to catch rain when it comes." "You'll need help," Martha pointed out. "That's not work for one man alone. Some of the other ranchers have offered to pitch in if I'll help them with similar work after. Community effort, everyone's finally realizing we need to be better prepared for the next drought." "And the cattle drive?" Josephine asked. 3 weeks from now. I'll take the remaining herd north myself, leave them with my cousin in Kansas until things improve here. He hesitated. It means I'll be gone for at least a month, maybe 2. The news settled uncomfortably in Josephine's chest. I see. Unless, Preston glanced at Martha, then back to Josephine. Unless we were married before I left, then you'd legally be mistress of the ranch in my absence, could make decisions if needed. Martha made a small sound of approval. Very practical thinking, Preston. But Josephine saw beyond the practical reasoning to the question in his eyes. This wasn't just about ranch management. It was a declaration of intent, a step toward the future they'd begun to imagine together. Is that a proposal, Mr. Galloway? She asked, her voice steadier than her pulse. He reached across the table for her hand. It is, Miss Valenti. Not perhaps the romantic one you deserve, but sincere nonetheless. His blue eyes held hers. I know it's been just 3 weeks, but I've come to care for you deeply. Your strength, your wisdom, your faith in possibilities, they've given me hope when I'd nearly lost it. Martha discreetly slipped from the room, giving them privacy despite propriety's requirements. This drought brought you to me, Preston continued, and whatever hardships we face, I know now I want to face them with you beside me. So yes, Josephine Valenti, I'm asking if you'll do me the honor of becoming my wife. Josephine's heart raced as she considered his words. She'd come to Texas expecting security, but found instead a struggling ranch and a man fighting to save his legacy. Yet in that struggle, she discovered something precious, a partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection. Preston Galloway was everything her letters had suggested, and more honorable, hard-working, and kind, even in the face of potential ruin. Yes, she said simply, I will marry you, Preston. His smile transformed his face, years of worry momentarily erased. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet and into an embrace that respected propriety while promising more. You've made me the happiest man in Texas, drought and all. Martha returned with suspicious timing, bearing a small bottle of blackberry cordial she'd been saving for a special occasion. I believe congratulations are in order, she said with a knowing smile. They were married 5 days later in Madisonville's small church, with Martha Wilson and the local doctor serving as witnesses. Josephine wore her best dress, a deep blue that matched Preston's eyes, and carried wildflowers that Martha had somehow found still blooming despite the drought. Preston, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt with his Sunday coat, looked at her with such tenderness that she momentarily forgot the hardships that had brought them together. I, Preston James Galloway, take thee, Josephine Marie Valenti, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he vowed, his voice clear and certain in the small church. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. When Josephine repeated the same vows, she felt the weight and promise of each word. This was no arrangement of convenience now, but a true marriage, built on a foundation far stronger than the circumstances that had initially drawn them together. The wedding celebration was modest, a small gathering at the town's only restaurant, with a cake Martha had somehow managed to bake despite flour rationing and a few gifts from townspeople who seemed genuinely pleased to see Preston happy despite the grim times. They returned to the ranch that evening as husband and wife, Martha tactfully announcing she would stay in town with friends for a few days to give them privacy. Preston carried Josephine across the threshold of the ranch house with a solemnity that quickly dissolved into laughter when he nearly tripped over the entry rug. Not the most graceful start to married life, he admitted, setting her carefully on her feet. But an honest one, she replied, straightening his collar. I didn't marry you for your grace, Preston Galloway. What did you marry me for, then? He asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. She considered her answer carefully. For your resilience, your kindness, your willingness to fight for what matters. Her hand rested against his cheek. And because when you look at me, I feel seen in a way I never have before. His arms circled her waist, drawing her closer. "And here I thought it was for my vast fortune and thriving cattle empire," he teased. She laughed, the sound bright in the quiet house. Those were merely bonuses. Their first kiss as husband and wife was tentative at first, then deepening with shared longing. When they finally separated, breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I have to leave in 10 days, he murmured. "I wish the timing were different." "We'll make the most of the days we have," she promised, "and I'll be here waiting when you return." Their wedding night was a discovery of each other, gentle, passionate, and ultimately transformative. In Preston's arms, Josephine found a connection her brief first marriage had never provided, and in her responsive warmth, Preston found healing for the loneliness that had plagued him even before the drought. The next morning, they woke as true partners, their future bound together regardless of what hardships lay ahead. The days before Preston's departure flew by in a flurry of preparations. Work began on deepening the well, with neighbors coming to help as promised. Josephine learned more about running the ranch, absorbing Preston's knowledge of the land and animals with quick intelligence. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, talking about their hopes for the future children, prosperity, growth, while acknowledging the challenges they still faced. These quiet moments, hands intertwined and dreams shared, cemented their bond more than any wedding ceremony could. Martha returned after a week, resuming her role as housekeeper with tactful awareness of the newlyweds' need for privacy. Her presence would be essential after Preston's departure, providing both companionship and an extra pair of hands for ranch work. The night before Preston was to leave with the cattle, they lay awake long into the darkness, unwilling to surrender to sleep when each minute together felt precious. "I'll write whenever I can," he promised, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "And I'll come home as soon as the cattle are settled." "I know you will." Josephine propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the moonlight filtering through the window. "We'll be fine here. Martha and I will manage the ranch, and the well work should be finished before you're gone a week." "You're not worried?" he asked. She smiled. Terrified, but also certain we're doing what's necessary. Her hand found his in the darkness. "I believe in us, Preston. In what we're building together." His kiss was tender, a promise without words. "When I return, we'll plant that garden you've been planning. Start making this place truly ours." Morning came too quickly. The small herd of 18 cattle was gathered near the house, ready for the long journey north. 2 other ranchers would travel with Preston, their combined herds making the trip safer and more efficient. Josephine stood on the porch, determined not to show the fear that knotted her stomach at the thought of a week's without him. She'd packed food for his journey, mended his clothes, done everything practical a wife could do to prepare her husband for such a trip. Preston checked his saddlebags one final time before turning to her. His arms went around her waist as he pulled her close, unconcerned with the neighbors watching nearby. "I love you," he said simply, the first time he'd spoken the words aloud. "I think I have since you first challenged me about not mentioning the drought in my letters." Tears pricked her eyes despite her resolve. "I love you too. Be safe and come back to me." Nothing could keep me away. He kissed her once more, then mounted his horse. "Remember what I told you when you first arrived? We'll weather this storm together, Josephine. That's a promise I intend to keep." She watched him ride away, the cattle moving slowly ahead of him in a cloud of dust until they disappeared from sight. Only then did she allow herself a moment of weakness, a few tears shed in the privacy of their home, before squaring her shoulders and turning to the tasks that awaited her. Life without Preston fell into new rhythms. The well deepening was completed within days, revealing a stronger water source than they dared hope for. Josephine threw herself into ranch work, learning from Martha and the occasional helpful neighbor how to manage what Preston had left behind. His first letter arrived 3 weeks after his departure, carried by a traveler heading south. He wrote of the journey difficult but manageable, the cattle holding up better than expected, as they moved toward greener pastures. He wrote of missing her, of falling asleep thinking of her smile, of planning improvements for the ranch upon his return. She read the letter until the paper grew soft from handling, then wrote back, describing the completed well, her efforts to establish a small kitchen garden using their precious water, the way the community had come together to help each other through the continuing drought. "The land misses you," she wrote, "as do I. But we persevere, believing in the future we'll build when you return." Days stretched into weeks. July burned into August, the heat unrelenting, the sky cruelly clear. But the deeper well held, providing enough water for their basic needs and the small garden Josephine had planted close to the house, where every drop could be carefully controlled. Martha proved invaluable, her decades of experience in drought conditions helping them conserve resources while maintaining hope. In the evenings, she shared stories of previous hard times and the recoveries that followed, reinforcing Josephine's faith in the land's resilience. "My Henry always said Texas land is like a good marriage," Martha told her one evening as they shelled the precious peas from Josephine's garden. "Takes work every day, breaks your heart sometimes, but rewards you beyond measure if you stay faithful through the hard times." A second letter from Preston arrived in late August. The cattle had reached Kansas safely and were thriving on his cousin's lush pasture land. He hoped to start the journey home within 2 weeks, which would bring him back to Madisonville by early October if all went well. "Hold on just a little longer," he wrote. "I dream of our reunion every night." September brought the first change in the weather, not rain, but cooler temperatures that made work less exhausting. Josephine expanded her garden cautiously, experimenting with drought-resistant plants a traveling peddler had recommended. The surviving cattle grew stronger with careful management of grazing and water. And then, on the last day of September, the miracle happened. Clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy with promise. Josephine watched them approach, hardly daring to hope after so many disappointments. Martha joined her on the porch, her experienced eyes assessing the sky. "Those aren't teasing clouds," she said with quiet certainty. "There's rain in those." By evening, the air had changed, becoming heavy with moisture. The wind picked up, bringing the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Josephine and Martha worked frantically to position every available container to catch water barrels, buckets, pots, anything that could hold the precious liquid. The first drops fell just after sunset, tentative patters that quickly strengthened into a steady downpour. Josephine stood in the doorway, watching the parched earth drink in the blessing, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered to whoever might be listening, "God, the sky, the land itself." Martha came to stand beside her, her weathered face alight with joy. "It's breaking," she said simply. "The drought is breaking." The rain continued through the night and into the next day, gentle but persistent. By the second evening, the creek bed was flowing again, and patches of green appeared almost miraculously where there had been only dust before. Word spread through the community, similar rains were falling across the region. The drought wasn't over entirely, but this was more than a temporary reprieve. This was the beginning of recovery. Josephine wrote to Preston immediately, knowing her letter would likely reach Kansas after he'd already departed for home, but unable to contain her need to share this joy with him. She described the rain, the renewed creek, the community's cautious celebration. "The land is coming alive again," she wrote, "just as you promised it would. Come home to see the miracle, my love." October brought more rain, not enough to flood, but sufficient to sustain the land's awakening. Grass began to reclaim barren pastures. The garden flourished. Even the air felt different, carrying hope rather than desperation. Josephine counted days, calculating Preston's likely progress homeward. Martha helped prepare the house, ensuring everything would be perfect for his return. Together they baked bread with precious flour saved for this occasion, cleaned every corner of the house, and repaired items that had been neglected during the worst of the drought. On the morning of October 12th, Josephine was hanging freshly washed curtains when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She froze, listening intently, then dropped the fabric and ran to the door. A single rider approached, his familiar silhouette causing her heart to leap. She was off the porch and running before conscious thought, her skirts gathered in her hands, propriety forgotten in the joy of the moment. Preston saw her coming and dismounted quickly, meeting her halfway between the house and the road. His arms caught her as she threw herself against his chest, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of weeks of longing. "You're home," she whispered against his neck. "You're finally home. I told you I'd come back to you." His voice was rough with emotion as he set her down, his hands framing her face. "And look what you did while I was gone, you made it rain." She laughed through tears. "Yes, that was entirely my doing." His kiss was hungry, weeks of separation dissolving in the heat of reunion. When they finally broke apart, he looked around in wonder at the transformed landscape patches of green where there had been only brown, puddles reflecting the sky where dust had swirled, life returning to the land he loved. "It's a miracle," he said softly. "One of many," she agreed, her hand finding his. "Come inside. There's so much to tell you." Martha greeted them at the door with uncharacteristic tears and a warm embrace for Preston, before tactfully announcing she would visit neighbors to spread news of his return, giving them privacy for their reunion. Inside, Preston looked around with fresh eyes at the home Josephine had maintained and improved in his absence. New curtains, repaired furniture, the scent of fresh bread all spoke of her care and commitment. "You've been busy," he observed, pulling her close again as if unable to bear any distance between them. "I had to be worthy of this partnership," she said, smiling up at him. "How was your journey? The cattle?" "Safe with my cousin until spring. They're already looking stronger." His hand brushed a strand of hair from her face. "But I missed you every moment." They talked for hours about his journey, her management of the ranch, the rains that had finally come, plans for the future, now that the worst seemed behind them. As darkness fell, they moved to the porch to watch the sunset together, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest. "I have something to tell you," she said after a comfortable silence, "something I've been saving for your return." He looked down at her, curious. "More good news, I hope?" Josephine took his hand and placed it gently against her abdomen. "The most wonderful news. We're going to have a child, Preston, in the spring, when the land is truly green again." His face transformed with wonder and joy. "A child? You're certain?" She nodded, her eyes shining. Martha confirmed it. "She's helped bring enough babies into the world to know the signs." She bit her lip, suddenly uncertain. "Are you pleased?" In answer, he gathered her into his arms, his joy too great for words at first. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it," he finally managed. "A child, Josephine, our child, a new life to match the land's renewal." They sat together in the growing darkness, making plans, sharing dreams, celebrating not just his return, but the future they would build together. The drought had brought them to each other, tested their resilience, and ultimately strengthened the bond between them. "We weathered the storm," Preston said softly, echoing his promise from the day of her arrival. "Just as I said we would." "And there will be others," Josephine acknowledged, practical even in her happiness. "Other droughts, other challenges. But we'll face them together," he promised, sealing the words with a kiss. "Always together." The months that followed proved the drought truly broken. Winter brought more rain, replenishing aquifers and preparing the soil for spring planting. The community recovered slowly but steadily, neighbors helping neighbors rebuild what had been lost. Preston worked tirelessly to implement the improvements they'd planned: cisterns to capture rainwater, irrigation channels, drought-resistant crops. Josephine's garden expanded, providing food for their table and even surplus to share with neighbors still struggling. As her pregnancy progressed, Josephine's energy never flagged. She worked alongside Preston when possible, managed the household with Martha's help, and began preparing for the child who would represent their future on this land. Letters from Preston's cousin in Kansas brought news that their cattle were thriving, ready to return home when the spring grass was established. Each positive report reinforced the wisdom of their difficult decision to separate the herd rather than watch it die. In late April 1876, just as the Texas wildflowers painted the once barren landscape in brilliant colors, Josephine gave birth to a son. They named him James Thomas Galloway James, for Preston's father, Thomas, in memory of Josephine's first husband, whose death had ultimately led her to this new life. Preston held his son with reverent wonder. The tiny boy's features a perfect blend of his parents. "He'll know only the good times," he promised. "He'll see this land as it's meant to be." "He'll know the stories of the drought," Josephine corrected gently. "So he understands the value of perseverance, of partnership, of faith in what can't yet be seen." By summer, the ranch was unrecognizable from the struggling operation Josephine had first encountered. Green pastures supported the returned cattle, now increased by spring calves. The expanded garden provided abundant vegetables. The creek flowed strong and steady, supplemented by the cisterns that would help them through future dry spells. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Preston surprised Josephine with a proper gold band to replace the simple ring he'd been able to afford during the drought. They stood together on the porch, their son sleeping peacefully inside, and renewed their vows privately. "I promised we would weather the storm together," Preston said, sliding the ring onto her finger. "What I couldn't have known was how much joy would follow the rain." Josephine looked out at their thriving ranch, at the home they'd built through hardship and hope. "The drought brought me to you," she said softly. "For that alone, I would endure it again." "Let's hope that won't be necessary," he replied with a smile, drawing her close. "But if it comes, we'll be ready." Their kiss sealed not just a year of marriage, but a promise for all the years to come, years of growth and challenge, of family and community, of a love that had been forged in the crucible of drought and emerged stronger for the testing. As twilight settled over Madisonville, Preston and Josephine Galloway stood together on the land they both loved, their future as bright as the first stars appearing in the Texas sky. The mail-order bride who had arrived during a drought and the cowboy who had promised they would weather the storm together had created something rare and precious, a partnership that could withstand any hardship life might bring. And in the years that followed, as their family grew and the ranch prospered, they never forgot the lessons of that first difficult summer, that the most beautiful beginnings can emerge from the harshest conditions, and that love, like the resilient Texas land, will always find a way to flourish again after even the most devastating drought.